I am pleased to welcome you to the first open session of the Facilitation course. Our first topic, what is facilitation? Why do you as HR need to learn facilitation? The thing is, spellcasters who can flip meetings not only save the company money on external facilitators, but also better engage employees, including managers, with their projects and ideas. And today we are going to see how that works and what the essence of facilitation is. The course website looks like this, Academy Facilitation. With me, I think a lot of people are familiar, but nevertheless, I will briefly recap. My name is Mike Pritula in different companies. I have facilitation skills. The one that needed the most, perhaps, was Starlight Media. I was trained in coaching there. Coaching and facilitation have a lot in common, including, for example, asking the right questions. And then there is the list of companies I have worked for. It is a career that is about 15 years long. Relies on global best practices, list of companies I follow, and I would be grateful if you also briefly write about yourself, city, position, and companies. I think many of you already know the schemes in general, so share, imagine, let us get to know you. So let us go ahead, and when you write, I will be ready to read out so that others do not have to wait. I will move on. So those who are already in the course waiting for homework is required for graduation. They need to be completed with either a grade of 4 or a grade of 5, then we will give out an angle. Here is the first answer, Almaty and a specialist. Thank you. There is also a Facebook question. You can watch the video later in the recording. Yes, it will be recorded on our YouTube channel and posted in the Mike T Academy Telegram chat. Okay, so today is our first class. We are preparing today, or rather not preparing, but learning what facilitation is. In the second session, we will study in detail how to prepare the facilitation. In the third, how to manage. In the fourth, how to achieve, or rather how to complete. On the fifth one, there will be different life hacks. And on the sixth one too, there will already be a recess there. In our session today, we will talk about how facilitation relates to decision-making in a company and why facilitation is the way to do it. Best to make decisions rather than through other approaches. We will explore the basic principles of facilitation today and understand the role of the facilitator of such a person. Next, let's talk about what facilitation is used for. In general, what are the business benefits of doing facilitation? And let's talk about the most important skill a facilitator needs in order to do his or her job effectively. So the big secret of facilitation. Why facilitation is becoming more and more popular. Why I hear it more and more often, I think you do too. You can do better when decisions are produced by and made or understood by the people they are meant to influence. That's the key right there. Basically, facilitation is done to get some of the people who are important to you on the project themselves came up with their ideas to the required result and then were happy to implement them. Here, for example, is the most popular type of facilitation. Let's ask that question. What do you think is the most popular type of facilitation? Or in what facilitation in today's companies is most often used? In what process? In what kind of meeting? Please write in the chat room who thinks so. Okay, I'll read it out. We've been chatting about dating. So Revda Sverdlovsk, region and manager, Kripishny Zavod. Thank you, Irina Mikhail, and manager of Akfa Tashkent company. Thank you. So this is, let's say, a phrase, not even a word very much in the rumor mill right now. It's often said we spent in the company, and that's probably one of the main uses of facilitation in today's world. There you go, as the most massive. What do you think the process of such a company is? I would say, probably without facilitation, it is not even possible to realize it. It's possible, but it won't work. Daily retro. Yes, Anton, we can agree, but that's where companies that apply Agile principles come in. Although I'll sidestep the business aspect, it's quite right to say that in Agile-style meetings, facilitation is needed in retro and daily Scrum. So Firuza, and the answer from Firuza about the session. Exactly. Look, friends, strategic sessions are, in my opinion, the #1 most common tool where companies use facilitation. It's in these strategic sessions that management and shareholders gather key employees so that these key employees themselves come up with solutions, set their own goals, and then implement them. Because when something is handed down from above by the owner, people often don't accept it. People sabotage, people don't understand. People don't like being handed ready-made solutions, and as a result, they don't engage. That's why in strategic sessions today, you could say it's rule #1, to conduct facilitation, a facilitated strategic session. External facilitators are often invited, although internal ones can be used too. And ready-made goals aren't given, but tools are used. A guided meeting is conducted, during which the top management team arrives at the necessary goals. And then these goals are approved and the top management team implements them. So now for the most important formula for facilitation success. An effective solution developed in a company is the product of two components, the right decision and the level of people's commitment to that decision. If some decisions are made in a company, even if they're 1,000,000% correct, but people aren't committed to them, then the decision won't be effective. And for decision, you can put anything here. New strategy, company restructuring, changes in organizational structure, launch of new products, cultural changes, process changes, implementation of a KPI system. Basically, any change that happens in a company, any decisions that are made, they will only be effective if and only if they are correct and have a high level of commitment. And it's fair to say that if the decision is wrong, but the level of commitment is high, that won't be an effective solution either. If everyone decided that salaries need to be increased tenfold, the commitment would be huge, but the decision would be wrong, so it wouldn't be effective. That's how facilitation works. And in this formula, facilitation works on this part of CD, which is commitment to the decision. That is how committed people are to the decision. If they are committed, then the decision will be implemented. And the problem with modern companies is that often decisions are handed down from the top by some shareholders, consultants, or the chief executive officer alone. Here, implement it. This is how you do it. And people at the bottom don't accept this. So I can say, and I'm not afraid to use this word, I don't see anything wrong with it. Let's face the truth. Let's call it what it is. Facilitation is a way of manipulating people so that they come to the right decision themselves, and at the same time, the level of commitment increases significantly. Don't let the word manipulation bother you, because we are very often manipulated in life. Any advertisement is manipulation. Any game, any gamification is manipulation. In general, it's part of our life. We should eat very simple food, but we manipulate ourselves. We add spices, salt, sugar, and thus deceive ourselves that it's even more delicious. So, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that. Let's move on. The truth of life is that even the best decision can turn out to be completely ineffective. If people aren't interested enough in it or don't understand it, you may have a 100% correct solution. If employees accept it at 0%, then in the end, it's a 0% solution. I'm sure you've also witnessed such decisions where people weren't involved and they didn't implement them afterwards. And conversely, when they were involved, they made decisions and were then ready to execute them. My next question to you is, please think about it. It might not have been a full facilitation, but it could have been any meeting where the leader applied an element of facilitation. In other words, think about the last time you participated in decision making and then were involved in its implementation. Just try to remember the dates. Was it today, yesterday, a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, or maybe some of you have never participated in such a process? Just remember when it was and write in the chat when you participated in some decision-making process and then felt that it was partly your decision too. And write down how long ago it was. How long ago was it? Let's see how often this happens in your life as well. So what's happening? How's it going? Who will speak up? Who will write something? And no one remembers. But if you don't remember yet, for example, I recommend that you start paying attention to how you're involved in certain decisions. You might not even be aware of it. You might not know. She wrote in the spring of 2020, you might not even realize that you've been involved in decision making and that you later agree with it. For example, elections in the country. What is that? It's collective decision making, for which you are also responsible afterwards. You feel like you participated in it somehow. There are many such instances. Maybe I recommend you start paying attention. A meeting of managers, a parents' meeting at school or kindergarten. You're invited there to make joint decisions so that you'll be responsible for their implementation later. But often such manipulation is disguised, just like marketing. I'm not saying it's bad or dramatic, but it's a fact of life. December 2020. It happens. So facilitation is the answer to these kinds of questions. You could say it's an answer, a tool, or a solution. The question is how to get people interested enough to participate in finding a solution. Sometimes this is necessary. Sometimes you need people to become interested in looking for solutions. Some call it how to increase employee initiative. That's facilitation. The second question is how to maintain focus, keep meeting participants focused on the goal and engaged in the process. In other words, you could say how to stop having boring meetings. Next, how to ask questions that don't alienate the group. That's also interesting. When you need to, for example, as a young leader, build communication with a group, what questions to ask and how to ask them. How to guide the group without putting too much pressure on it, that is, without appearing too authoritarian. How to handle disagreement and achieve consensus. By the way, disagreement is a normal issue in many teams. And facilitation is the answer to how to deal with it, how to handle it when someone disagrees. Next, how to communicate with people who refuse to participate, try to dominate others, or exhibit other types of unproductive behavior. And finally, how to ensure that participants are sufficiently committed to the common cause. That's what facilitation helps with. You need to use, I don't know, voting, brainstorming techniques, some icebreakers, and so on. But there are many other underlying skills. For example, how to keep the group's energy sufficiently active. In this course, we will study all the necessary skills for successful facilitations, which provide both tools and deep understanding. In this course, we will be studying one approach to facilitation. In general, facilitation, like coaching, has many forms. There are many authors who see facilitation in their own way. There are different schools, certification organizations, and so on. Among all these different approaches, we will be studying one of them, which I believe is the most truly effective: smart facilitation, someone's approach who developed it. At the end of the lesson, I'll show you, explain, and you'll be able to familiarize yourself with it. In terms of comparing different approaches, it seemed to me to be the most appropriate. This smart facilitation has a specific cycle: preparation, session opening, group focusing, information gathering, working with a marker, and session closing. There are the right questions that cover all stages of the session. There's work with group dynamics to ensure the group functions well, feels good, comfortable, and produces solutions. Therefore, we'll study all the elements of smart facilitation in this course. Now let's look at an example case for facilitation. Where might you need this? In what situations can you realize that, yes, right here, facilitation would definitely help me? Here's an example of such a case. You, or more precisely, your human resources director, is tired of hearing about hiring problems. Some departments complained that searching for and hiring a new employee takes too much time. Other units were concerned that their representatives weren't very involved in the candidate selection process. Some even thought that the company was hiring people who lacked basic skills. It's a very typical situation, by the way. I've encountered it too. It's very common and widespread for many managers, for example, in the recruiting department. So, let's assume that the human resources director appointed you to lead a cross-functional team of 12 people and also tasked you with studying the problem and adjusting the hiring procedure, including creating a plan and schedule for implementing the changes. Without understanding what facilitation is, how it works, and how to implement it, this task will be difficult to solve. Sitting down to write it yourself, going to each person to communicate, test, and then combining everything and somehow bringing it together is not an option either. But facilitation in such a case can certainly help. When there are different people involved, we'll now discuss the conditions for facilitation. Let's move on. When is facilitation appropriate? When an important problem has been identified, the solution isn't obvious at first glance, and agreement is necessary for successfully solving the problem. In other words, it's necessary for several people to eventually come to an agreement, so that they don't leave with their individual opinions, but with a collective opinion, a collective decision. Therefore, facilitation is appropriate when several people are involved in the discussion and they need to understand the problem and agree on key issues. That's when facilitation will be appropriate. What is a facilitation session? First and foremost, it's a well-structured meeting. Well, I can also say that, in principle, any meeting will immediately gain some percentage points in productivity if you start applying facilitation tools. So, it's a meeting where the leader, who is also the facilitator, guides participants through a series of predetermined steps to achieve a result, so that this result is developed, understood, and accepted by all participants. That's what a facilitation session is. My next question to you, without any time constraints, is: have you ever participated in facilitation sessions? Something like that. You might not have known it was a facilitation session, but have you observed, felt, or gone through something like this or not? Put a plus if yes, a minus if no. Okay, I see plus plus, excellent. We have people who have experienced it. Great. So there are some plus plus here, even more pluses. So it's not something cosmic or extraterrestrial. It's quite real, something we're starting to encounter. That is, it's becoming a part of our lives. The role of facilitators, these people who engage in facilitation, is to guide meeting participants through certain stages. At the same time, facilitators don't impose solutions. Here, we'll see now. If you're familiar with coaching, you'll see many similarities. The only difference is that coaching is most often individual work, although there is team coaching, while facilitation is working with a group. Instead, they use their understanding of process stages and group dynamics. Understanding group dynamics, that is, how people behave in groups, is very important. This is to help participants achieve desired results and to take into account the specific needs and characteristics of individuals. As a result, outcomes are achieved by the meeting participants themselves and are understandable and acceptable to all of them. I'll give you a hint right away that facilitation can improve teamwork, so it can be used as a team building method, and you can, so to speak, reconcile conflicting team members. Through facilitation, you can lead people to share their doubts and come to a common solution. Now, regarding the responsibilities of a facilitator, there are several approaches, several ways a facilitator can work. A facilitator can be a consultant when they help the leader plan the meeting, but during the session, the facilitator remains on the periphery of the meeting and steps in only when asked to do so, or when a situation arises that participants cannot handle on their own. In this role, the facilitator is the second person. The first person is the one who conducts the meeting. The second option is the meeting manager. Here, the facilitator sets the agenda, establishes ground rules, initiates discussion, and allows the session to develop, intervening only when necessary. Here, the role is similar to that of focus group organizers. Typically, in focus groups, a topic is introduced, and participants are expected to develop this topic on their own. The third role is that of the meeting leader. Here, the facilitator sets the agenda, establishes ground rules, and initiates discussions, just as a manager would. They also explain why the meeting is important, help participants become engaged in the process, and maintain the necessary level of group focus on the work during discussions, asks provocative questions when appropriate, and does everything possible to ensure that each participant contributes to the discussions. For example, when conducting a strategic session, which we discussed at the beginning, the best role for the facilitator is that of the meeting leader, while the owner or chief executive officer are simply participants. That's when it works best. And another format is when the facilitator acts as a participating facilitator. The facilitator begins working almost like a meeting leader, setting the agenda, establishing ground rules, and initiating discussions, but also actively participates in discussions, offers their point of view, shares opinions on various issues, and expresses disagreement with others' comments. In a strategic session, if it's conducted by a strategic session consultant rather than a universal facilitator, they can act as a participating facilitator. They can share some of their own insights. These are the kinds of roles that can exist. Consequently, a facilitator has several, you might say, responsibilities. In some cases, they're an inspirer. In others, they're a guide, interviewer, mediator, subtle psychologist, peacemaker, keeper of order, and observer. A good facilitator must do all of these things to ensure a successful process. It can also be said that the facilitator is the soul of facilitation. In fact, a lot depends on the facilitator's personality. Facilitators care about people, want to help, and this pushes their own ego aside. Therefore, to be a successful facilitator, a person usually needs to do some work on themselves. In other words, they need to reach that point. This is true for coaching, training, and other similar fields as well. That is, you need to set aside your ego a bit and start working with the team, taking care of them. However, there are situations where facilitation is not necessary. Again, you need to understand where it works and where it doesn't, where a solution doesn't need to be developed, where there's only one correct answer and no room for deviation, not a step to the left or right. It won't be useful in such cases. When the situation or related information is too complex or too confidential for the group to understand. In such cases, participants are not interested in a common solution or don't trust each other enough to work it out together. So you need to work on building trust first. Or when time constraints don't allow for a facilitator-based approach. In other words, when you need to implement and execute something quickly. So there's a checklist of the points we've discussed. If you answer no to any of them, you probably don't need to use facilitation. What are the trends in facilitation? What's happening with facilitation worldwide? First, facilitation is becoming more of a skill than a role, whereas before a facilitator was a separate role. Only a few people knew and understood what it was. Very few could actually do it, so they had to search for facilitators and hire them. Now it's simply taught, and anyone can be a facilitator, an executive, HR, anyone. Next. Globally, people are increasingly understanding what facilitation is and its value. They're starting to appreciate it more and understand it better. Third point, facilitation is moving into virtual reality, or rather not virtual reality, but the online world. Even online facilitation tools are emerging. For example, a project like Miro, I think you know about them, those visual boards, but we'll talk about that. This is a response to the need to facilitate people online. Because people don't necessarily meet offline anymore. And the youth of facilitators, I mean, before they used to be super experienced, very mature people. Now, in principle, a fairly young person can become a facilitator. They wrote about this. A Scrum Master doesn't necessarily have to be some super experienced developer or CTO. It can be a young person who has learned the technique, the technology, and applies it. These are the trends happening in facilitation. Now let's pull back the curtain a bit and look at the essence of a facilitator's work. So, what's the most important thing in a facilitator's work? What's the most crucial skill? Of course, it's asking questions, as is basically the case in coaching, for example. Asking the right, powerful questions is actually the most important thing that happens in facilitation. Therefore, a good facilitator must think through what questions they will ask, and essentially write out the agenda in the form of questions through which the facilitator will guide the participants. That is, questions that participants will seek to answer. This is, in essence, the backbone of a facilitation session. Starting the work, a set of questions, general overview, and wrapping up the work. Let's move on. Why is this skill important? Why is that initial question in each block so important? Because the group will be engaged or not, will work or not work depending on how good a question the facilitator asks. If the question is not very good, complex, or confusing in some way, people will sit and wait. That is, they won't get involved, they'll start to react. So we can draw an analogy that the initial question is like the firing of a starter pistol. If it's well formulated, it fires and people start running. Here are two examples of an initial question. Question type A. First of all, we need to discuss the initial data, what it should be in the case of creating a schedule. And type B. If you needed to develop a school schedule, what information would you need? The second question is simpler, more in everyday language, and more specific than question type A. Why is question type B better? It uses language as in everyday life. That is, as a rule in facilitation, the facilitator speaks in very simple words, avoids professional terminology and jargon, complex constructions, and so on. Also, the second question is more personal, it's action-oriented, and it's open-ended. So there you have it. How to learn to always ask type B questions. You need to start with a phrase that creates a certain image in the minds of the facilitation participants. For example, remember, imagine, what if, think about. These are good question starters. Then people start to engage, they start to reflect. They place participants inside a scenario and prepare them to see the answers. So you'll see that for a good facilitator, you need to understand a bit more about how to formulate questions correctly. Example of initial questions. For example, type A. How is hiring currently organized? What stages does the process include? It's very dry and technical. Yes, this question is often asked at work, but it doesn't kickstart facilitation. And a type B question is more effective. Let's list the steps that the current hiring procedure includes. Imagine that one of your employees walks into your office and says they're quitting in 30 days, and that during this time you need to find someone to replace them and train them. You realize you need to solve this problem and start running through your head the actions you'll need to take to get a new colleague. You recall everything that you personally need to do, as well as other employees. Let's list some of these steps. What do you need to do to hire someone? So the facilitator approaches it from a bit of an outside perspective and gently provokes people into some kind of reasoning and offers suggestions. That is, they don't take a hardline stance. Describe the hiring process, tell a backstory, create a lead-in to then ask a question, and that's how you get people involved. People find it more interesting. People feel more comfortable. People are more willing to share. There are usually people in a facilitation who, when they hear this kind of engaging, simple question, can't sit still and already want to speak up. This is a good sign of facilitation, when after the facilitator's question, people almost start interrupting each other to give an answer as quickly as possible. If after the facilitator's questions everyone sits in silence, it means that something was overcomplicated somewhere. Here's another example. A type A question that is not very suitable for facilitation. What problems do we have with the current hiring procedure? A type B question. It sounds different already. Let's now turn to the problems with the current hiring procedure. Think back to the last time you had to hire someone. Think about what was challenging for you, what made you nervous, what didn't work out, or took too much time, or seemed like a waste of time. Think about things that make you exclaim, surely there must be a better way to do this. What are at least some of the problems with the current hiring procedure that frustrate you personally? This kind of question also fully immerses you in the process and reasoning, and allows facilitation participants to engage and really share experiences, discuss important things, and also come to an agreement. And another option, what could we do to improve the current hiring procedure? Again, this is also a very dry question. A common question that leads to a dead end? That's the kind of question. meaning there's no immediate answer that comes to mind. And the second question, the alternative, is one that an experienced facilitator would use. So, we're ready to create a list of actions that can improve the hiring procedure. Look at the problems we need to solve. Think about what could be done to address these. Recall if you've seen anything suitable in other organizations. Consider how to use their approach to improve the hiring procedure and what things will allow us to better organize this work. Let's list ideas suitable for improving the existing procedure. Who would like to start? Super easy. It gently leads people to start sharing ideas. It's clear, easily formulated, and people will likely be eager to start participating. Continuing the discussion, this is a hint about what might happen, how an inexperienced facilitator might respond, how an experienced facilitator would respond, and the type and purpose of the question. This is an example of how we will prepare in this course to conduct our first facilitation session. Here's another example, a tip on how to suggest an idea to a group. When presenting an idea to participants, ask them to articulate its advantage and suggest words to write it down. For example, start with the phrase, "What about?" Then ask what benefits they see in this idea and what words they think I should use to write it down. That's how it can be done. A checklist for asking questions, summarizing our today's session and its final parts, in which we touched upon the most important skill of any facilitator, the ability to ask questions. First, I'm forming the first precise element of the checklist. It creates a vivid image that allows participants to visualize these answers. The second element, start with a phrase that paints a picture in one's mind. For example, think about, remember, and so on. Imagine something there. Next, create an image that allows participants to see the answers. Ask a direct question, choose an appropriate form for your question. And there you can use different word choices. Words like can, should, need to, will for different situations. We use the word can when we need to generate the maximum number of ideas. The word should is used to lead to actions. Need to is to give people a sense of responsibility. And will is for them to make commitments. Now let's try to think about this, considering what you've already seen about facilitation and what you've learned about the most important skill of a facilitator. On a scale of 1 to 10, how useful do you think facilitation skills could be in your typical work? 10 points means you clearly see that you can't do your job at all without it. Well, for example, a facilitator, 0 points. You see that you don't need it at all? You work in the police or the military, you give orders that are followed without question, you don't need it at all. How would you rate it? Olya, on a scale of 1 to 10, how applicable and useful is it in your work? These skills, this knowledge, these facilitation approaches, please share. It's interesting to hear your assessment. Okay, our first response is the number 6 to 7. Thank you, Zana. Who else? What number do you think? Number 7. Let me give you an example. For instance, one of my first positions was as a recruiter. I see a lot of value even for the position of a recruiter. Although there isn't a group of people, just an individual essentially to some extent, an interview is a form of facilitation. We need to guide the person so that they talk about themselves, think about something, and possibly even come to a decision. You know, I've observed that the most successful recruiters manage to make the candidate decide for themselves by the end of the interview whether they're suitable for the position or not. In other words, the candidate simply gets great satisfaction from such an interview. Okay. Does anyone else want to share? Well, I guess that's all for now. So that's the average score for now. Let's move on. Responsive questions to what's been said, checklist. Ask the next direct question to form a critical evaluation. Why is this so important? Ask a summarizing question to clarify what you understood. It seems you're talking about, is that correct? Ask a quantitative and follow-up question to help the participant provide the necessary clarification. This is important because ask a probing question to find specific solutions. Are there solutions in the area of? Ask a redirecting question to bring the conversation back on track. That's a good point. Can we add it to our list of questions so we don't forget and then return to what we were discussing earlier? This is very important. In meetings, discussions often go off topic. And if you tell people, friends, let's not get distracted, it can often offend them and disrupt the flow of the meeting. If you respond in more of a facilitative style, it doesn't offend people and maintains the momentum. Facilitation takes into account people's psychology and group dynamics better than many traditional meeting tools. Next, ask a follow-up question to help guide the group in the right direction. We've discussed this and that. What else should we do? All of these questions are very effective. Again, if any of you have studied coaching, you'll see there are many similarities. I would even go so far as to strongly recommend that all coaches take a course in facilitation to learn how to work with groups, and for all facilitators to take a coaching course to learn how to work with individuals. Because facilitation and coaching are like your right and left hands. Together, they complement each other perfectly. All right, now for the homework assignment for those already in the course, you need to choose a topic or solution that requires facilitation. Check the checklist to see if facilitation will really help and create a facilitation structure in the form of key questions. That's your homework assignment for today. Now for the promised book and the name of the author who developed the smart facilitation approach. I'll say it again, facilitation is a very popular tool worldwide. There are many facilitation approaches, many authors, books, schools, even certifications, and so on and so forth. But for me, out of all this variety, I like Michael Wilkinson's approach, who came up with the secrets of smart facilitation guide for working with groups, the basics of which we've studied today. With that, our session on facilitation is coming to an end. I'd appreciate your feedback. Please write down what was most useful for you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. And of course, I invite all of you to take the course. I'll say it again, I believe facilitation is very important, especially for those working with virtual employees, because while group dynamics can be maintained somewhat in offline meetings, it's even more challenging to maintain group dynamics online. I mean, a person could just be sitting there mindlessly playing Counter-Strike, or, I don't know, browsing Facebook or doing something else, and you wouldn't even know or see it. So Anton writes, thank you very much for the webinar. You're welcome, Anton. Please come to our open webinars. For those who will be watching on Facebook, I'd be grateful. Please share, like, and on YouTube, you can subscribe to the channel to get updates about all webinars as soon as they're uploaded. If there are no questions or comments, I want to wish everyone a good Friday and a great weekend, and I'll see you at the next open webinars. Stay updated, be responsive, plan your time, and keep developing to have the most up-to-date knowledge. All right, great. Thank you. You're welcome. Well, that's it then. We're done here. Bye-bye, friends. It was great to see you all.